Okay, good afternoon and Happy New Year, since I haven't been here in 2024, even though New Year's is a long time ago now, 22 days ago. It's over 3 weeks ago. Anyway, we're going back 91 years. My name is Evan Weiner, and over there is Adolf Hitler. Elections have consequences. In 1932, there were two significant elections in the world. One in the United States, one in Germany. That guy's party, the Nazi Party, won the elections, and of course Franklin Roosevelt won the elections in the United States. Albert Einstein fled Germany. Radio, politics, and propaganda. Radio is really 7 years old in terms of network radio. NBC started in 1926, and it's only been about 11 years since radio started to proliferate in the United States. And both in Germany and in the United States, radio is used for some propaganda purposes. The League of Nations, diplomacy is failing. This, of course, started after World War I. The United States never got involved in it. It was set up to prevent wars like World War I, and it failed miserably. There is a sergeant's revolt in Cuba, and there is one person, one very famous person that you know whose life was impacted in Cuba by the Sergeant's Revolt in 1933. Want to guess?
Fidel.
Desi Arnaz.
Oh, Castro.
Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz. Newfoundland fails as a country. They went bankrupt, Newfoundland. It is the Depression. Prohibition ends. It's done, although if you wanted to get a drink between 1920 and 1933, you could easily find it. The Chicago World's Fair takes place, a century of progress, 1833 to 1933. Baseball's first All-Star game, and that is Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, the first All-Star game that took place as a promotion for the World's Fair. And the National Football League. In a couple of weeks, the biggest sporting event will take place in the United States, the Super Bowl, and the Super Bowl roots go back to December 13th, 1933, the first National Football League championship game. And how many of you watched this movie, King Kong? Nobody? Nobody ever saw King Kong and Fay Ray on top of the Empire State Building? Yeah, now you recognize it. That's King Kong with Fay Ray. That makes its debut. And you know what also makes its debut? The Three Little Pigs. How many of you remember the Three Little Pigs? See, that you remember. And drive-in movies. How many of you went to the drive-in movie back in the day? Yeah, you don't want to tell me what happened in the back seat of the car, do you? I worked there. I worked at a drive-in movie for 3 years. This is the gang I worked with. I keep in touch with one of those guys, the guy with the headband, Dan Rich, who lives up in Hartford now, and that was our softball team for the Rockland Drive-In movie back in the days when I was 18 and 19 and 20 years old, back in 1974, 75, and 76. The drive-in movie concept starts in 1933. So that's Kaiser Wilhelm from Germany. He's inspecting the troops, and we have a world war on our hands back in 1914. The First World War and its subsequent peace settlements gave rise to new ambitions, rivalries, and tensions. People had high expectation that the post-war peace settlement would create a new world order and ensure that the slaughter of the First World War would never be repeated. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, 11/11 at 11:11 a.m. in the morning. The Treaty of Versailles, these are the four guys splitting up Europe. On the right is Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. Also there, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and Georges Clemenceau of France. Those four would not be around all that much longer. Clemenceau hated George, Wilson had a stroke, and Orlando would be replaced eventually by Benito Mussolini. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in January 1919, created the League of Nations. That was an international body that was intended to promote peace and prevent war. America never joined the League of Nations for various reasons, including isolationism. The treaty was an uneasy compromise between the victorious allies, Britain and America, and France and Italy. And all four countries had different interests, so they did not really care all that much about the Treaty of Versailles once it was done. Germany was forced to surrender territory, disarm, and pay for the war's damage. These divisive conditions were criticized as overly vindictive by many in Britain and America, and the treaty's terms caused immediate outrage and lasting bitterness in Germany, particularly for this guy, who was a wounded Austrian soldier who happened to be in the German army, Adolf Hitler, who was not German. But there's an irony out of the Versailles Treaty. Germany would be eventually in a strong geostrategic position. There was a buffer created between them and Russia by Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states, and Russia was one of the traditional rivals of Germany. Fighting among the new states left them weak. There was an overthrow of a government in Poland, and the geography of the new borders made the new countries difficult to defend. So Germany would come out of World War I actually in pretty good shape. Small, weak states on the eastern border. 1923 is the official end of World War I with the Treaty of Lausanne signed in Switzerland. The Versailles people were done in June of 1919, but other people worked on the treaty, and it was signed by France and Britain and Italy and Japan, Greece and Romania, and the new Republic of Turkey.
Does that have two names? Because you said Versailles.
Versailles, yeah.
Well, that didn't say Versailles.
That's Lausanne. That was July of 23 in Versailles. Why did Hitler hate Jews? Well, why did Hitler hate Jews? I mean, it came out in 1919. He sent a letter to somebody saying he didn't like Jews. Well, remember, he's a soldier in the German army. And he's there between 1914 and 1918. And after the war is over and Germany surrenders, he and German soldiers like him couldn't get over the defeat of the German Empire. The German Army Command spread the myth, the big lie, the myth, the big lie. That the Army, no, they didn't lose on the battlefield. That couldn't be. They couldn't lose on the battlefield, even though Germany was hemmed in. But, you know, why go into facts when you could tell a lie? They had been betrayed. Well, who betrayed them? It was called a stab in the back at the time, and Hitler bought into the myth. Jews and communists had betrayed the country and brought a left-wing government to power that had wanted to throw in the towel. And this is Hitler in 1920. 1919, he writes the letter. 1920, he's out there and he begins to speak. It's February 24th, and Hitler is in Munich, and he delivers the Nazi Party platform speech to a large crowd. This is what historians refer to as the foundation of Nazism. The German Workers' Party had existed, but Hitler, well, you got to give him credit, as much as I don't want to give him credit, but he knew how to speak in front of a crowd, and he could read the room. He was really good at that. He was also an artist. You got to remember that. He was an artist, kind of an actor. And he laid out a 25-point platform. The central idea that you have to strengthen German citizenship by excluding and controlling the Jewish population and others that are deemed to be non-German, including him. He's not German. He's Austrian. So under the Hitler plan, he would have been thrown out of Germany because he's not a German. Some Germans began to support Hitler even though he was an Austrian citizen and also he was non-German. And he writes Mein Kampf while he's in jail. That's in 1924. And he predicted a general war that would result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. Mein Kampf was written while he was a prisoner, although you kind of wonder how much of a prisoner he was. He did not wear a prison outfit. He could speak to anybody he wanted. He had free reign in the jail, and he had his own personal secretary, Rudolf Hess. who had dictated Mein Kampf to. He was arrested during the Munich beer hall push when the Nazis tried to overthrow the German government between November 9th and 10th, 1923. And he got pardoned from jail, December 1924. Apparently, he was a model citizen in jail. So why did he hate Jews? There is Hitler along with party members in 1922. Well, he blamed the Jews for the defeat. He created a stereotypical enemy. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the defeated country was still in a major economic crisis. It eased a bit in the mid-20s and it would come back after the Depression in 29. According to the Nazis, expelling the Jews was the solution to all of their problems in Germany. Well, why the Jews? Well, Karl Marx, yeah, he was born Jewish, but he never practiced Judaism. But of course, he is the father of communism. Jews represented everything that the Nazis found repugnant. Finance capitalism, Rothschilds. Controlled, the Nazis believed, by powerful Jewish financiers. International communism. Karl Marx was born a German Jew, and the leadership of the German Communist Party was heavily Jewish. Modern cultural movements like psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, and even swing music, George Gershwin. And there is Hitler in 1932, no doubt practicing how to speak, and you can see he's dramatic. And remember, Berlin was the film capital of Europe in the mid-1920s to late 1920s. Had a lot of great actors and great movies, and there he is practicing. On February 25th, 1932, Adolf Hitler became a citizen of Germany. He was born in Austria in 1899, immigrated to Germany in 1913, renounced his Austrian citizenship in 1925. His political message and the promise to make Germany economically strong again won Hitler and the Nazis the elections in 1932. Only 4 years earlier, only about less than 3% of people in German government were Nazis. They did this all in about 3.5 years. Hitler's rise. The worldwide economic depression and the rising power of labor unions and communists convinced increasing numbers of Germans to turn to the Nazi Party. The Nazis fed on bank failures and unemployment, proof, Hitler said, of the ineffectiveness of democratic government. Hitler pledged to restore prosperity, create civil order by crushing industrial strikes, and street demonstrations by communists and socialists, eliminating the influence of Jewish financiers and making the fatherland once again a world power. There's only one guy in his way now, only one, and he's 86 years old. His name is Paul von Hindenburg. On January 30th, von Hindenburg names Adolf Hitler leader or Führer of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, Chancellor of Germany. Hitler's plan is embraced by the population. Do away with politics, make it a dictatorship. I'm in charge. And make Germany a powerful, united, one-party state. And Hitler has some allies. This guy is Franz von Papen. Von Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Hitler as Chancellor on the advice of Franz von Papen, a disgruntled former Chancellor who believed the conservative bourgeoisie parties should ally with the Nazis to keep the communists out of power. The decree of protection of the German people makes Hitler the guy. Using emergency constitutional powers, Hitler's cabinet issued a decree for protection of the German people on February 4th. The decree placed constraints on the press. Freedom of the press is got. Authorized the police to ban political meetings and marches, effectively hindering the electoral campaign. And then there's this fire at the Reichstag, suspicious fire. It's February 27th and the German Parliament building burnt down. The origins of the fire are unclear. In a propaganda move, however, the coalition government, Nazis and the German Nationalist People's Party, blamed the communists. The Nazi leadership and the coalition partners used the fire to claim that the communists were planning a violent uprising. And here is the fire. The Nazi leadership, they said, hey, you know what? They did this fire, and with the fire, the Nazis were able to persuade the President Paul von Hindenburg that communists were planning a violent uprising to derail Germany's national renewal. The Nazi government claimed the emergency legislation was needed to prevent this. The resulting act, commonly known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, abolished a number of constitutional protections and paved the way for the Nazi dictatorship. And here is Hitler assessing the situation. There's only one guy left that he's got to knock off, and that's von Hindenburg. Implemented one day after the fire, the decree suspended the right to assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and other constitutional protections, including all restraints on police investigation. Hitler had the police in his back pocket. The decree gave the regime the authority to overrule state and local laws and overthrow state and local governments. The Enabling Act comes now. On March 23rd, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, the partner piece of the legislation to the February 28th decree for the protection of people and state. The Enabling Acts assigned all legislative power to Hitler and his ministers, thus securing their ability to control the political apparatus. It takes 5 years. 5 years, and the Nazis are in charge, and Germany is done as a democracy. Nazis are totally in charge. It took only a few months from the elections of '32 for the Nazis to seize the entire country. It wasn't only Jews that Hitler hated, he also hated the Slavs, hated them. And who are Slavs? Russians. The Nazi Party foreign policy aimed to rid Europe of Jews and other inferior peoples, absorb pure-blooded Aryans into a greatly expanded Germany. If you look at Hitler, he does not look like an Aryan, or at least what they thought the Aryan should look like. A Third Reich, and wage unrelenting war on the Slavic hordes of Russia, considered by Hitler to be subhuman. That is what the Aryan youth is supposed to look like. Blonde hair, blue eyes. Not like Hitler. Hitler had dark hair, looked ugly, and had a mustache. Anyway, and this is a doctor showing the perfect Aryan, or the perfect kid to be an Aryan. Imagery. The German sports imagery of the 1930s served to promote the myth of Aryan racial superiority and physical prowess. In sculpture and in other forms, German artists idealized athletes' well-developed muscle tone and heroic strength and accentuated ostensibly Aryan facial features. This guy was not welcome. His name is Erich Siegel, and he was Jewish, and he was a boxing champion of the world. In April, an Aryans-only policy was instituted in all German athletic organizations. Non-Aryans, Jews, or individuals with Jewish parents, or Roma, gypsies, were systematically excluded from German sports facilities and associations. The German Boxing Authority expelled professional light heavyweight champion Erich Siegel because he was Jewish. And this guy goes to Daniel Pren. He's a champion tennis player on the Davis Cup team for Germany, and he's removed. And let me tell you a little bit about Gretel Bergmann, a world-class high jumper expelled from her German club. I had a chance to interview Gretel Bergmann in 1993 at the New York Athletic Club. And she was expelled, but she's also the best woman athlete in Europe, and they knew it. So it was kind of a wink and a nod, go to London, train, and we're going to bring you back for the 1936 Olympics. And she ends up going to London to train, and she comes back to Germany, and she competes to get out to the 1936 national team. And she wins all the races, sets a record in one of them. And 2 weeks before the Olympics in 36, they pull her off the team. Now, I see her, it is 57 years after the fact. And her name in the United States is Margaret Lambert. Margaret was her real name in Germany, and she married a guy by the name of Dr. Bruno Lambert, who was also an athlete, Olympic caliber athlete in Europe in that time. And, you know, this is not, when you're asking questions, there's not much to ask about Gretel Bergman if you know the background of the story. In fact, it was all boiled down for me to a one-word question: why? And she said, you got to understand, starting in 1933, my people had our rights taken away, our jobs, our home, our chance of education. We were subhuman. But I had to give people a ray of hope in 33, 34, and 35, that things could be okay. And she went along with it. She fled Germany in 1937. In 2002 or 2003, HBO did a special called Hitler's Pawn, P-A-W-N. If they could get it here, watch it. It's her life story, and I'm just giving you a little thumbnail sketch of it from the interview I did with her. But it's well worthwhile, the 1 hour. It's called Hitler's Pawn. Anyway, so Gretel Bergman is expelled from her German club. And there's Albert Einstein, who decides he's going to expel himself from Germany before he's expelled from anything. On October 17th, Albert Einstein arrives in the United States, where he settles permanently as a refugee from Nazi Germany and takes up a position at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, New Jersey. He flees Nazi Germany in March. He was rumored to be on Hitler's hit list. Franklin Roosevelt becomes the President of the United States on March 4th, 1933. And there he is with his predecessor, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover may have been a victim of circumstances in 1929 when the stock market crashed. It was heading in that direction, but he really didn't do very much to help the situation after the stock market crashed. It's November 8th, 1932, and the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt defeated the Republican Herbert Hoover. Over the past 72 years, Democrats controlled the White House for just 16 years. It's a consequential election. The 1932 election was the first held during the Great Depression, and Americans wanted to change from Hoover's Depression-era policies. On Election Day, Roosevelt received nearly 23 million popular votes, 57.3% of the vote, to Hoover's nearly 16 million, or 39.6% of the vote. But in the electoral vote, which is where it counts, FDR crushed him, 472 to 59. It's a repudiation of not just of Hoover, but of the Republican Party. The Americans elected a substantial number of Democratic majorities to both the houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Well, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, and he's coming in for a New Deal. But Hoover is still the president for the first 2 months of 1933. By inaugural day, March 4th, most banks had shut down. Industrial production had fallen to just 56% of its 1929 level. 13 million people were out of work, and farmers have been in desperate straits since the end of World War I. They weren't helped by either Warren G. Harding or Calvin Coolidge or Hoover when they were president, so they were in desperate straits. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt promised prompt, decisive action, and he conveyed some of his unshakable self-confidence to millions of Americans listening on radio throughout the land. And you probably had to know this particular part of his inauguration during your school days. This great nation will endure, as it has endured, will revive and prosper. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And every one of you probably learned that in high school. So he's now the President of the United States, and after taking the oath of office in March, he called a special 3-month session of Congress, which proceeded to pass some 76 pieces of legislation. FDR halted a spiraling financial crisis by declaring a national bank holiday and signed reforms to prevent future meltdowns. He freed the United States from the gold standard. He legalized beer, which was a major campaign issue in 1932. During the days of Prohibition, America could not collect the tax on alcohol. They lost a significant part of the tax base. Some of it was made up by an income tax. He stood up for public works and relief agencies, rescued rural America with farm subsidies, launched a massive regional development effort by creating the Tennessee Valley Authority. The economy would eventually heal. He became president, and he had the National Recovery Act and that eagle. By the way, that eagle, if you're a football fan, National Football League fan, and know of the Philadelphia Eagles, that football team was named after the National Recovery Act, and the eagle became their nickname. They had a little different eagle, but that's how that came about. Some key parts of the agenda in the first 100 days turned out to be a bust. The centerpiece of Roosevelt's recovery effort was the National Industrial Recovery Act. The NRA was an essential element in the National Industrial Recovery Act in June, which authorized the President to institute industry-wide codes intended to eliminate unfair trade practices, reduce unemployment, establish minimum wages, maximize hours, or maximum hours, and guarantee the right for labor to collectively bargain. The NRA legislation was overly complicated and reflected the interests of big business at the expense of consumer and small businessmen. But the act did improve labor conditions in some industries and also aided the unionization movement. The Emergency Banking Act of 1933, that's on March 9th, 5 days after he's inaugurated, he signs that act, which was aimed at restoring public confidence in the nation's financial system after a week-long banking holiday. And the fireside chat. Now, Roosevelt's not the first guy ever to be on radio. Warren Harding was on radio, and Warren Harding, while he was President of the United States between 1921 and 23, embraced technology. His successor was Calvin Coolidge, known as Silent Cal, except he too used radio, and Herbert Hoover was part of radio in early 1920s. So Roosevelt, even though he gets kind of credit for being on radio, really wasn't the first president of radio. That had been gone back well over a decade by this point. In his first fireside chat on March 12th, Roosevelt explained the Emergency Banking Act as a legislation that was promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress and gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. The new law allows the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets, and thus the banks that will reopen will be able to meet every legitimate call. Now, Roosevelt didn't even use the fireside chats as president as his first foray on radio. That was in upstate New York. He knew how to use the radio. It's still a rather, by this point, it's only 13 years old. At least commercial radio is only 13 years old. So it's relatively new. The first commercial radio station broadcast took place in Pittsburgh on KDKA Radio, November 2nd, 1920. The program aired was the results of the 1920 presidential election between Warren G. Harding and James Cox. Roosevelt lost that night. He was Cox's running mate. New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt gave at least 39 addresses. 29 of those were given exclusively over WGY in Schenectady, that was the General Electric radio station, or over a limited network of New York stations. On March 7, 1929, Roosevelt spoke on the WGY network in his first fireside chat. He was the governor. And there is a NBC microphone. Roosevelt would speak directly to the American people over the airwaves, and he would come to them not in the formal setting of an inauguration or a conference, but in a more personal manner. He would join them in radio in their homes after dinner and speak frankly in plain terms. And he would open up the broadcast addressing the listeners as my friends. Even his enemies, he'd call my friends on radio. Anyway, Roosevelt would do 4 fireside chats in 1933, March 12th, May 7th, July 24th, October 23rd. He would only use the radio on special occasions. Oh, you might recognize some of his quote-unquote radio competition. Jack Benny, Eddie Cantor, Ed Wynn, who had the first real show on radio, entertainment show in 1922, Burns and Allen, Al Jolson, Rudy Valley, and comedies like Amos and Andy, and dance shows featuring bands. So he's among that group of people who's on radio. Meanwhile, in Hitler's Germany, this is the Volksempfänger, and that's a radio. And they have developed radios in Germany, not for entertainment, although if you consider Hitler entertainment, that's what you got. In the 1930s, everyone wanted a radio. The still new invention brought news, music, dramas, and comedy right into the home. The propaganda minister in Germany, Joseph Goebbels, saw it as a potential, or saw its potential to transmit Nazi messages into the daily lives of Germans. The only hurdle was producing and disseminating the devices on a mass scale. Under Goebbels' direction, the Volksempfänger, or the People's Receiver, was born.
Oh boy.
This is the Yonkers Library, Yonkers, New York, where I speak occasionally. And it's Edwin Armstrong. And this is a weird museum because it's also the Yonkers Hall of Fame. And it's behind the reference desk. And there are some people who you probably heard of. Joe Lapchick, if you were a college basketball fan. He was a St. John's coach, coached the New York Knicks. But other people who were raised in Yonkers, like Sid Caesar. You've heard of Sid Caesar, I would think. And also, even though she didn't know, Ella Fitzgerald. She lived in Yonkers. She wasn't born there. And while she lived in Yonkers, she headed a big band. And then there's this guy, Edwin Armstrong. And for any of you who listen to FM radio, he is the father of FM radio. Working in a secret basement at the laboratory at Columbia's Philosophy Hall, Armstrong developed a wideband FM, in the process discovering significant advantages over the earlier narrowband FM transmissions. He was granted 5 U.S. patents covering the basic features of the new system on December 26th. Okay, I have a question for you. How many of you listened to The Lone Ranger? So, is it hi-ho silver or is it hi-yo silver?
Hi-yo.
Hi-yo? How many say hi-yo? How many of you say hi-ho? Well, you're both right. You're both right. Anyway, The Lone Ranger first appeared on radio January 30th on WXYZ in Detroit, conceived either by the station owner, George W. Trendle, or by Fran Stryker, the show's writer. Test episodes appeared earlier on the radio station WEBR in Buffalo. The Lone Ranger is a fictional, masked former Texas Ranger who fought outlaws in the old American West with his Native American friend, Tonto. Maybe you remember Tonto. So, is it hi-ho or hi-yo? Well, this is the same radio station, KORC, in Eugene, Oregon. And it's the same radio station, and they have ads for the Lone Ranger. On this one, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday night, the Lone Ranger rides again, sponsored by Williams Bakery. That one, the Lone Ranger, no sponsor, rides every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7:30. The Green Hornet, remember the Green Hornet? That was also on Tuesday and Thursdays at 7:30. But even though this radio station is carrying the Lone Ranger, they're not sure if it's Hi-Ho Silver or Hi-Yo Silver. What is it? Well, come on, Silver, let's go, big fellow. Hi-Yo Silver! Away! It seems to be both. The radio stars. How many of you recognize Eddie Cantor? How many of you listened to Eddie Cantor? Making Whoopee, that was his big song. He wrote a lot of double entendre dirty songs. He got away with, Eddie Cantor. Eddie Cantor's Chasing Sanborn Hour was the top rated show in America. Rudy Valley, it's hard for people to imagine this, was as big as Sinatra, as big as Bing Crosby, as big as Elvis in his day. Every Thursday night, Fleischman Yeast Hour was popular. Paul Whiteman's Kraft Music Hall, also known as the Kraft Phoenix program, featured Al Jolson for 12 of the 42-week run. Ed Wynn's Texaco Fire Chief, Amos and Andy, Burns and Allen, the Guy Lombardo Show. How many of you remember those names? Were in the top 10 rated shows of the year. Jack Benny, Fred Allen, Bing Crosby all had shows. Lowell Thomas had the most listened to radio broadcast. By the way, do you know who created Lawrence of Arabia? I may remember Lawrence of Arabia. It was Lowell Thomas who created Lawrence of Arabia. Well, the world is becoming increasingly dangerous, and that's the League of Nations, Society de Nation, and that doesn't work. Japan had invaded Manchuria on September 19, 1931, seized control of the country, China. This was a violation of the rules of the League of Nations. So Japan officially was reprimanded and said, yeah, we don't have to stay here. Bye. They beat it. In October, the German government announced its withdrawal from the League of Nations. The reason was a refusal of the Western powers to acquiesce in Germany's demands for military parity. After the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany was disarmed. Well, that's the end of that. We're going to do what we want, and we dare you to stop us. Down in Cuba, the Sergeants' Revolt, Fulgencio Batista. Cuba has been a problem for more than now, we're in 1924, more than 125 years. A revolt headed by the non-commissioned army officers, including Batista, triggered the revolution of 1933. Upset by proposals for pay reductions for the lower echelons of the army and restrictions on promotion, plus the desire to receive immunity for their crimes as participants in the terror of Machadado, they arranged to meet members of the students' university on September 4th. By this time the students arrived, the sergeants were in command and had arrested many army officers. Batista and the students agreed to overthrow the President Quesada. Five-man group, the Pentarchy, was formed to head the provisional government. Sergeants' Revolt signaled the Army's entry as a force into the government, which Batista emerged as a self-appointed chief of the armed forces, and the uniting temporarily of the students in the military to govern Cuba. One person or one family that fled Cuba during that time was a family, you might recognize the name, Arnaz. The Arnaz family fled. And you probably know the rest of the story if you watched I Love Lucy. Desi fled. He was all of 16 years old. Austria, Austrofascism. On May 20th, the Fatherland Front was the right-wing conservative national and corporatistic ruling political organization of the federal state of Austria. It claimed to be a nonpartisan movement aimed to unite all the people of Austria, overcoming political and social divisions. It was led by the Christian social chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. Dollfuss' party was the only legally permitted party in the country. It was organized along the lines of Benito Mussolini's Italian fascism, fully aligned with the Catholic Church, although it did not advocate any racial ideology as Italian fascism later did. It advocated Australian nationalism and independence from Germany on the basis of protecting Austria's Catholic religious identity from what they considered a Protestant-dominated German state. Stalin says yes in 1933. On November 16th, the United States and the Soviet Union established formal diplomatic relationships. On November 19th, voters in the Second Spanish Republic general elections opt for the right-wing parties to represent them. There is a move to fascism and authoritarianism and right-wingism that started in the 1920s that's really gathered speed in the early 1930s. Well, Newfoundland failed as a country. See, if the dog looks, you can see two dogs. These are the two dogs that allegedly saved Newfoundland from something. One's a Newfie and one's a Lab. And this is Newfoundland Labrador. St. John's. It always rains in St. John's. Anyway, the Newfoundland economy collapsed during the Great Depression. Prices plunged for fish, its main export. And you got nearly 300,000 people there, and they have run out of money. Britain assumed general responsibility for Newfoundland's finances. Newfoundland would give up self-government. The legislature accepted the deal. It was formalized when the British Parliament passed the Newfoundland Act of 1933. And this is the Maine law. And the Maine law basically was take the booze out of everybody's hand, except in northern Maine is separated from Canada and New Brunswick by just this river, so if you really wanted to get booze in Maine, really wasn't much of a problem. The temperance movement had its origins in Maine, the world's first total abstinence society, founded in Portland in 1815. State Organization of Temperance Societies was formed in 1834. Within a dozen years, had developed enough political clout to force the enactment of a state law prohibiting the sale of alcoholic spirits, except for medicinal and mechanical purposes. I never got that mechanical purposes. What are you supposed to pour booze into your tractor? Or your sewing machine? Or your washing machine? I never got that. Portland's Neil Dow was known internationally as the father of Prohibition. He leads the way, and Maine approved a total ban on the manufacture and sale of liquor in 1851. But there was British North America right across the way, just a river in between, so you could always get a stash smuggled in. This is Boston, by the way, and this is right down the street from the State House, where all the politicians are. And it is Boston's original speakeasy. Carrie Nation carried a sledgehammer or an axe and got rid of a lot of bars with the Anti-Saloon League and all that other stuff, women's temperance movement back in the day, and they named this bar after Carrie Nation, and it was a speakeasy on top of that. On January 19th, 1919, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. Now, there was something called the Rum Runners, and the Rum Runners built these little boats that were faster than anything that the Coast Guard had. So they could travel at much faster speed than any of the boats that the Coast Guard had in its fleets. This allowed them to avoid being raided, arrested, and having their shipment confiscated by law officials amidst the run. The Rum Runners were up on the border, and basically Arnold Rothstein, who put organized in the word organized in the organized crime two-word couplet, he had a fleet of freighters who would come in from Europe and drop off booze, and somehow he was able to do that. I wonder how he was able to do that. Anyway, there is Prohibition, and Rum Road was set up not long after the federal prohibition was passed, which was a line of Canadian fishing vessels set up along the Canadian coastline north of Maine. They positioned themselves just outside the 3-mile limit of the country, just far enough from Coast Guard patrol boats. The rum runners would buy their shipments off the Canadian fishermen, and they would be able to evade the Coast Guard. Now, during the Prohibition, if you went into a speakeasy, one of the reasons it was called speakeasy is because you had to speak like that. But you needed a password to get in. Even Harpo Marx could get in. He knew what the password was. Swordfish. He has a sword in a fish. Swordfish. He was allowed in. When Prohibition took effect on January 17, 1920, thousands of formerly legal saloons across the country, catering to men only, closed. People wanting to drink had to buy liquor from licensed druggists. Try that again. Licensed druggists. For medicinal purposes, clergymen for religious reasons, or illegal sellers known as bootleggers. Another option was to enter private, unlicensed bar rooms, nicknamed speakeasies, and if you're Harpo Marx, all you need is a fish with a sword in it, and you walk in. One of the heroes, and he was a hero, gangsters were heroes back in the day. Whether it was Capone, whether it was Rothstein, George Remus, Bugs Moran, Lucky Luciano, they had this thing about them, and the American media really made them out to be heroes. Al Capone, 1931. Near the end of the 1920s, the prevalence of speakeasies, the brutality of organized gangs vying to control the liquor racket, the unemployment and need for tax revenue that followed the market crash of Wall Street, 1929, all contributed to America's wariness about the 18th Amendment. 1932, Roosevelt ran for president on a platform that included calling for a prohibition repeal. In February, Congress adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to the Constitution that would repeal the 18th. The amendment was submitted to the states, and in December, Utah, of all places, Utah, where they don't drink, provided the 36th and final necessary vote for ratification. The Maine law would remain in effect in one form or another until the repeal of national prohibition in 1934. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, Duck Soup. Duck Soup. How many of you have seen Duck Soup? The Marx Brothers? Oh, it's a great movie. You should play it for you. It is a really funny movie. And believe it or not, 191 years later, it holds up. It really holds up. Groucho is playing Rufus T. Firefly. He's a con man. And he's trying to get money out of Mrs. Teasdale says, I'm going to support Fredonia. Here's $20 million, but you have to have Firefly as your head. The four Marx Brothers and Margaret Dumont starred in a political satire that could have been about any dictator that was around, whether it was Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini. In fact, Chico Marx's character in Duck Soup is named Ciccolini. That's not much of a stretch from Mussolini, is it? The movie was released during the Depression. The tiny country of Fredonia is on the brink of bankruptcy, and the only way to save it is for Mrs. Teasdale, a wealthy widow, to donate $20 million to the cause. Her only stipulation, Rufus T. Firefly needs to be named the country's president, and if you wanted 66 minutes, that's all it is. It's 66 minutes, and you will laugh right through it if you get a hold of it. Duck Soup. Firefly is more interested in making time with Mrs. Teasdale than helping the country get back on its feet financially. Unfortunately, the leader of the neighboring Sylvania also has his eye on Mrs. Teasdale, so they solve the love triangle by declaring war on one another, which seemed to be going on at that time. Chicago World's Fair, 1933. lasted May 27th through November 1st, and was so successful, carried on to 1934. And there were some things that came out of this. Most of this fair is gone. You can't really, there's like one artifact still around from this fair. World's Fair opened on May 27th. It was known as the Century of Progress International Exposition. The theme of the fair, many exhibits and structures at the World's Fair featured the Art Deco. Remember Art Deco? Chrysler Building in New York, that's Art Deco. And Art Modern design styles, which were at the height of their popularity. And the exposition was intended to provide hope for a better future during the Great Depression. Much of the funding for the fair came privately. There was really nothing in terms of public resources available, and it was wildly successful. Out of that, any baseball fans here? Just 2 baseball fans. That's it? 3 baseball fans. Well, they called the annual All-Star Game the Midsummer Classic in baseball, and it came out of the Chicago World's Fair. The newly elected mayor, Edward Kelly, was intent on making the fair a success and approached Colonel Robert McCormick, the powerful publisher of the Chicago Tribune, with the idea of holding a major athletic event in conjunction with it. So McCormick went to his sports editor, Arch Ward, and he said, let's come up with the game of the century. The best players in the American League and the National League would play each other at Chicago's Comiskey Park. Major League Baseball Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis gave his approval. The game was set for July 6th. 47,595 people packed into Comiskey Park. The American League beat the National League 4-2, and appropriately, because it was of its time era, Babe Ruth hit the first home run in World Series history. Now, Babe Ruth is synonymous with the New York Yankees, absolutely synonymous with the Yankees. However, had things been a little different, he might have been the manager of the Cincinnati Reds following the 1933 season. On December 29th, the Cincinnati Reds baseball team tried to buy Babe Ruth's contract from the New York Yankees. The plan was to have Ruth be a player-manager. The Yankees owner, the beer baron, Jacob Ruppert, said no. Cincinnati could have had Babe Ruth in 1914 in a trade with the minor league Baltimore team. Instead, they took Claude Derrick and George Twombly. Anybody hear of those 2 guys, Claude Derrick and George Twombly? Probably not. But you've heard of Babe Ruth, right? Who probably is baseball's greatest player of all time, because not only did he hit for a high average, not only did he hit all those home runs, but he also won 88 games as a pitcher in the teens. Also, the first NFL championship game took place in Chicago. The Depression hit the National Football League, devastated the league. Just 8 teams made it to the starting gate in 1932. The Boston Braves, the Brooklyn Dodgers, Chicago Bears, Chicago Cardinals, Green Bay Packers, New York Giants, Portsmouth Spartans, and the Staten Island Stapletons. Following season, the NFL added teams in Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. They dropped Staten Island. The NFL changed its rules to open the game up with the hope of getting more people to buy tickets to the games. Now, the Super Bowl. Is there going to be a Super Bowl party here? Super Bowl party. I mean, usually everybody, except for me, because I don't really care. I used to when I was working, but because I was working. But they're generally, everywhere you go, you can't miss it. Super Bowl, or the big game parties. This, the big game on big TV, all that other stuff. Anyway, this starts humble beginnings. July 8th, the Boston owner, George Preston Marshall, and the Chicago owner, George Halas, pushed through a proposal that divided the NFL into 2 divisions, with the winners to meet in an annual championship game. The first true NFL championship game took place at Wrigley Field in Chicago, December 17th. New York Giants playing the Chicago Bears. Chicago wins 23-21. Every player on the Bears earned about $210.34. Even with inflation, that does not equal the bottom level ticket at the Super Bowl this year. Giants players got $140.22 a piece, and I think it's about 20 times the amount. The numbers are, it's 20 times larger today than that. So how many of you saw King Kong? The old King Kong, the original King Kong. The one that came out in 1933. Anybody? You mean you never watched $1 Million Movie on Channel 9? Every 4 nights they played King Kong. Every 4 nights. How many of you were in the New York area in the 1950s and 60s and 70s? Or up here in Connecticut? Channel 9, the $1 Million Movie, always played King Kong. And there's King Kong on top of the Empire State Building. King Kong is a landmark American monster film, noted for its pioneering special effects by Willis O'Brien. The film premiered on May 2nd. It was the first significant feature film to star an animated character and also made the actress Fay Wray an international star. A film crew discovers the 8th wonder of the world. A giant prehistoric ape brings him to New York where he wreaks havoc. How many of you remember Three Little Pigs?
Yes.
Three Little Pigs. Walt Disney's The Three Little Pigs. And the song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? How many of you can sing Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? Anyway, The Three Little Pigs is an animated short released on May 25th by United Artists, produced by Walt Disney, directed by Burt Gillett. Based on the fable of the same name, The Silly Symphony won the 1934 Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film of 1933. The short cost $22,000 to make and brought back $250,000. This is gone. My teenagehood is gone. I worked there when I was 18 and 19 and 20 years old. It's called the Rockland Drive-In Movie. And it was a lot of fun for 3 years. I won't get into the fun. Anybody go to the drive-in back in the day? Anybody want to talk about their experiences at the drive-in?
No.
No? That was a very quick no. That was you in row 11 then, wasn't it? Our job, this is our job, we had a guy who, Emil Cambry, who looked like Elmer Fudd. I want you guys to kick out anybody who's fooling around in any car. It's like, yeah? Who's going to stop them? You! So you find somebody else for $2.15 an hour. Who's going to break up somebody in the back of the car? You can't do that, it's immoral. I said, well, yeah, but they're paying $2.25 each to come in here, so. Anyway, so that was the Rockland Drive-In Movie. First drive-in movie is opened on June 6th. Camden, New Jersey. It's created by Richard Hollingshead, called the Park-In Theater. It could accommodate 400 cars at a time, cost 25 cents per car, plus 25 cents per person attending the movie. You never saw any big run movies there. They ran B movies, at least when it started. Now, I grew up in the New York City area. In the New York City area, there was a drive-in on Long Island in Westbury, which is still there. The Whitestone Bridge, that's long gone. On Route 3 in New Jersey, in Paramus, that's long gone. Route 17 by Ramsey, that's gone. The one that I worked at, Muncie, that's gone. The one in Nyack is gone. The one in Orangeburg is gone. The one in Elmsford's gone. They're all gone, except for that one in Westbury. All gone. Wiley Post. He's a great aviator in his day. He became the first person to fly solo around the world in July. Post left. Floyd Bennett Field in New York, Brooklyn, returned after 7 days, 18 hours, 49 minutes. Post made several stops along the way, including Berlin, several in the Soviet Union, Alaska, and Canada. He flew a Lockheed 5C Vega named Winnie Mae. He had previously set the record for a non-solo around-the-world flight, the same plane with the navigator Harold Gatty in 1931. So this is the 1933 legacy. That's my wife and I up at the FDR Presidential Museum. Franklin and Eleanor were really, really good hosts. Look, they're smiling at us. They're kind of laughing. A little stiff. They didn't have much to say. They had books for us if we wanted to read, but the books were a little stiff too. I went up there because I needed to get information on a few things, like why did America go to the Berlin Olympics in 1936? Also, Roosevelt was the first guy in commercial TV in 1939 in the United States. And why did baseball go on after Pearl Harbor? Anyway, and I got the answers to all that. New Deal programs were successful. Programs like the Work Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, which to this day preserve parks that you can use around the country, created 10 million jobs. Participants built thousands of miles of roads and bridges, installed thousands of miles of water systems and electric grids. By 1939, the economy was improving. Unemployment dropped from 25% to 11%. That is Rostock, Germany, former East Germany. And that sign is no Nazis, no Nazis. Hitler and Mussolini would become allies. Albert Einstein would be part of the American development of an atomic bomb. Joseph Stalin would ally with the West during World War II. Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, which started World War II. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That war ended in 1945. The Nazi Party is outlawed in Germany. That is Desi Arnaz.
Wow.
That is a very young Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz was kicked out of Cuba in 1933 because his family was on the wrong side of the Sergeant's Revolt. His father was a political operative. His family, Barakardi Rum, you ever hear of that? The rum factory, Barakardi? That's his family.
Really?
That's his family. So he's born into a prominent family. His father was the mayor of Santiago, which coincidentally was where Fidel Castro came from. Following the political unrest in 1933, the family was forced to flee to Miami, ended up in Tampa going to college. Desi would become a band leader, pushed by Xavier Cugat. Remember Cugat? He would marry Lucille Ball and is one of the pioneers of American television. If there's no 1933 revolt, we might not have ever heard of Desi Arnaz. Batista ruled Cuba twice. First time 33 to 44, he had an efficient government, and 52 to 59, he was a dictator. He jailed his opponents, used terrorist methods, made fortunes for himself and his associates, the American Mafia. He was overthrown by Fidel Castro in 1959. 1948, Newfoundland residents voted to join Canada. Newfoundland officially joined Canada as a province on March 31st, 1949. Radio, that's a 23-year-old me interviewing the presidential candidate Jack Kemp, May of 1979. I would never have had that opportunity today to interview a presidential candidate like that. First of all, most radio stations have no news divisions anymore, but I cut my teeth at a 500-watt radio station. Learned everything I needed to learn. The golden age of radio lasted until 1955. AM stations have gone off the air in various markets. Radio stations used to be considered real estate, not anymore. Most radio stations have very little value, but in a disaster, they're going to keep going while this might not keep going. Chicago, my kind of town. My wife actually played that theater back in the 70s. Originally, the Chicago World's Fair was scheduled to run until November 17th, November 12th, 1933. It was so successful they decided, let's do it one more time in May to October 1934. Virtually nothing remains from that fair. The Major League Baseball All-Star Game became an annual affair, was usually popular through the mid-1980s. Arch Ward came up with the College All-Stars, first NFL champion charity game in 1934 in Chicago. Last game was played in 1976. Ward founded the All-American Football Conference in 1944. 3 All-America Football Conference franchises ended up in the NFL in 1950, the Baltimore Colts, Cleveland Browns, and San Francisco 49ers. And I am interviewing Joe Namath there. My friend Bruce Morton is with the ABC Mike Flag, is to my left, your left, and Joe Namath. That's from 1988. National Football League is the most dominant sports organization in America. The Super Bowl was created thanks to the 1966 merger of the American Football League and the National Football League. Joe Namath made the game important in 1969 when he guaranteed that he and his New York Jets teammates would beat the Baltimore Colts. The Super Bowl is a quasi-national holiday, with the game almost taking a secondary role to halftime shows, commercials, and parties. How many of you watch the Super Bowl just for the halftime show? You do. How many of you watch the Super Bowl for the commercials? How many of you like the Super Bowl because it's party time? And how many of you watch the Super Bowl because it's a football game? 2. It's about right, 2. This is Karstad, Alberta. That is the Fay Ray Fountain in Alberta, just north of Glacier National Park in Montana. There is King Kong. There is Fay Ray. She is from this little town in Alberta. There have been 11 King Kong movies. There have been 4 television shows, including the 2023 Netflix Skull Island. King Kong has become one of the most famous movie icons. King Kong has been featured many times in popular culture outside of the films themselves, in forms ranging from straight copies to parodies to joke references in media, from comic books to video games. In 1994, The 3 Little Pigs was voted number 11 of the 50 greatest cartoons of all time by members of the animation field. In 2007, 3 Little Pigs was selected to be preserved by the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Wiley Post there, unfortunately for Wiley Post, on August 15, 1935, Post and his friend, the humorist Will Rogers, left an airport in Fairbanks, Alaska, headed for Point Barrow. They were a few miles from where they were when they became uncertain of their position in bad weather and landed in a lagoon to ask for directions. On takeoff, the engine failed at low altitude. The aircraft uncontrollably nose heavy, dove into the lagoon at a low speed, shearing off the right wing. And it ended up inverted in the shallow part. Both men died instantly. In 1936, the Smithsonian Institution acquired the Winnie Mae, his plane, from Post's widow for $25,000. And that's it. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn to talk, because I am all talked out.